The events in this story take place in the Sankalakhiri Mountains in Narathiwat. Frank and two of his friends traveled up the mountain to harvest agricultural crops grown there. However, on that day, something unexpected happened, preventing them from coming down the mountain before dark. This was followed by a terrifying incident that occurred to them. Before we dive into our scary story, we would like to ask everyone to like and subscribe to support us in continuing to bring you more terrifying tales in the future. The whole story goes back about 20 years. At that time, Frank was a single young man, around 27 to 28 years old. He was born and raised in Narathiwat province. His village was located at the foot of a mountain range, specifically the Sankalakhiri Mountains. The forest within these mountains was incredibly fertile, with numerous tributaries formed from various streams on the mountain. Most of the people living in this area were engaged in rubber plantations and fruit orchards, such as durian and longkong. They cleared forest areas for agriculture, which became part of the mountain's cultural ecology. Additionally, the village names in this region were often derived from the names of the local streams. Besides agricultural activities, the villagers in that area also went into the forest to forage and hunt for food, sustaining their local way of life. However, there was a well-known restriction. No one was allowed to go up the mountain after 4 p.m. The reason for this rule was that ascending the mountain after that time could result in not being able to descend before sunset. Once dusk set in, various dangers could arise. Until one day, Frank and his two friends, Dave and Jack, decided to break this rule. They intended to go up the mountain, not very far, to pick fruits they had planted at the foothill, just about 1 kilometer from the flat area. Due to this reason, Frank and his two friends decided to hike up the mountain, even though it was almost 4 p.m. Frank and his friends took a familiar path. When they reached their destination, a cleared area where they practiced shifting cultivation, they immediately started harvesting the crops. One of Frank's friends, Dave, noticed a tall durian tree not far from where they were. Dave said he would go and climb the tree to gather some durian to bring home. Shortly after, while Frank was busy harvesting, a loud noise suddenly erupted from the direction of the durian tree where Dave had gone. The sound was as if a coconut had fallen forcefully to the ground. Frank and Jack immediately ran towards the source of the noise and found Dave's body lying on the ground. It appeared that Dave had fallen from the durian tree. Unfortunately, the spot where Dave fell had a sharp rock, and his head struck it hard, causing him to die instantly. The impact was so severe that the area of his head that hit the rock was split open, creating a gruesome wound. Fresh blood gushed out, soaking the ground, and it seemed like bits of his brain were coming out of the wound. From the state of the corpse, it was clear that Dave died instantly, without a single moment for anyone to help him. The incident left Frank and Jack in a state of great shock. At first, they were so stunned that they didn't know what to do. Once they managed to gather their wits, Frank quickly consulted with Jack about what to do with Dave's body. In the end, they decided that they had to bring Dave's lifeless body down to the village. Leaving it there would surely result in it being devoured by wild animals. With this thought in mind, Frank and Jack went to cut wood to make a stretcher for the body. By the time they finished, it was already dusk. At that moment, the once bright sky gradually became enveloped in darkness until everything was pitch black. As Frank and Jack carried Dave's body down from the mountain where the incident occurred, the darkness proved to be the greatest obstacle in their journey. The night made the already difficult descent even more challenging. After walking for a while, they arrived at a shelter constructed by the local villagers. This shelter, entirely made of wood, featured 6 posts and a roof thatched with grass and leaves gathered from the forest. Beneath the shelter, there was a bamboo platform. The villagers had built it as a resting spot to escape the sun while working on their farms and gardens in the mountains. Frank and Jack agreed to rest under the shelter for a while. Continuing their journey in the dark would only result in getting lost in the forest. The forest paths during the day and night are like 2 different worlds. They placed Dave's body on the bamboo platform and each lit a cigarette to relieve their stress. At that moment, they discussed what to do next. Should they wait until morning to continue down, or should they stay put, waiting for help? Frank was confident that his family and the villagers would come searching for them and provide assistance, as many people knew that Frank and his friends had gone up the mountain to harvest agricultural produce. The 2 of them sat and chatted aimlessly for a while until Jack noticed a dried beehive hanging from one of the shelter's posts. This gave Jack the idea to use the dried beehive to make a torch for light, and it worked. The torch made from the dried beehive functioned very well. Its light illuminated the surrounding area clearly. Frank then placed the torch above Dave's head, which allowed them to see the body clearly. At that moment, Frank wasn't afraid of ghosts or spirits at all. Even though he was sitting close to the corpse, he wasn't scared because he considered it the body of a friend. However, as Frank and Jack sat waiting for help from the villagers, something unusual started to happen nearby, something completely unexpected. At that moment, Frank suddenly noticed that Dave's corpse, which had only been dead for a few hours, was slowly opening its eyes. At first, he thought he was seeing things, so he looked again to be sure. To his horror, Dave's eyes were indeed opening wider, and the eyeballs were rolling around. After a moment of this, the eyes rolled back until only the whites were visible. But that wasn't all. Dave's swollen tongue, which had protruded from his mouth due to the impact of falling from the tree, began to twitch slightly, as if Dave were coming back to life. As Frank stood there, shocked by what he was seeing, Dave's corpse started to stick out its tongue and move it around, almost as if tasting the dried blood on his lips. What Frank saw with his own eyes made him scream in utter terror. Jack, who was sitting by the corpse's feet, jumped up, startled by Frank's outburst. When Jack asked what had happened, Frank described exactly what he had seen. However, Jack dismissed it as a hallucination, thinking Frank's eyes had played tricks on him. When Jack cautiously glanced at the corpse, he saw nothing unusual. Frank, turning back to look at the body again, also found it in the same state as when they had carried it down the mountain. While Frank was trying to convince himself that he had imagined it, a sudden gust of wind swept through their shelter, accompanied by a disturbing sound. It was a noise resembling the labored breathing of a very sick person, and it unmistakably came from Dave's corpse lying on the bamboo platform. This time, both Frank and Jack witnessed the unnatural occurrence. The corpse seemed to struggle against the vines binding it to the wooden stretcher, as if trying to break free. Both Frank and Jack were paralyzed with shock and screamed in terror. The sight before them was beyond horrifying. Dave's eyes were wide open, rolling around wildly. His tongue licked around his lips, and his abdomen appeared to bulge and contract, as if something was moving inside. The corpse continued to writhe, attempting to escape the vines that held it. Frank and Jack were on the verge of losing their sanity when, suddenly, the corpse of Dave attempted to speak, rasping out the words, "I'm hungry." Frank and Jack leapt out of the shelter, running for their lives down the path they had initially taken up the mountain, gripped by sheer terror. Fortunately, after a short while, they encountered a large group of villagers who had come searching for them out of concern. At that moment, Frank and Jack felt as if they had been saved by divine intervention. Among the search party was Frank's uncle, a skilled hunter and practitioner of the village's ancient arts. Frank, trying to gather his wits, recounted the harrowing events to his uncle. Upon hearing this, Frank's uncle instructed him to lead them back to the shelter from which they had just fled. As everyone walked closer and the shelter came into view, the light from the makeshift torch, crafted from the dried beehive, illuminated the lifeless body of Dave lying on the bamboo platform. The corpse was still bound to the wooden stretcher as before. However, there was now a tall, thin figure standing beside Dave's body. This figure had skin so dark it appeared almost like a shadow, staring intently at Dave. The villagers, about a dozen in number, began to shout in alarm at the sight of this mysterious figure. Their noise caused the shadowy man to lift his head and look at them before slowly fading away right before their eyes. Amid the villagers' fear, Frank's uncle led the group toward the shelter. At that moment, Frank and Jack followed closely behind him. Then, Frank's uncle turned to Frank and asked, "What did you make this torch from?" Frank immediately replied that they made the torch from dry beehives. Upon hearing this, Frank's uncle quickly extinguished the torch and said, "Don't you know? The local ancients forbade lighting beehives at night. They believed that igniting a beehive on the mountain would summon ghosts or spirits." Hearing this, Frank got goosebumps again, as neither he nor Jack had ever heard of this belief before. He then thought that the horrifying incident that had just occurred might have been caused by lighting the dry beehive. But what was even more surprising was that upon examining Dave's corpse, they found that his abdomen had collapsed as if it had no internal organs, and it was decomposing with a stench as though it had been left for 3 to 4 days, even though Dave had only been dead for a few hours. Amid the eyes of dozens of villagers who all witnessed the same thing, everyone standing there was filled with fear. Nevertheless, Dave's body was brought down from the mountain that very night. The next day, his body was taken for a religious ceremony, surrounded by the grief and sorrow of all his friends and family, including Frank and Jack. The horrifying events of that night remained etched in the memories of Frank and Jack, never to fade away.